Hey everyone, this is Lawrence Watkins, founder and CEO of Great Black Speakers, where we aim to shape minds one speech at a time. Today we're here with Dr. Sherri Williams. She's actually one of my favorite speakers and a speaker that is in high demand right now. She gets a lot of requests through our bureau, and recently she was named as one of the 8 fierce feminists that you should watch in 2017 by NBC Black news outlet. And she's an expert on race, gender, and how African Americans and women are portrayed in the media. And we wanted to talk to her a little bit more about feminism and her expertise and what she speaks on and those types of things. So, Dr. Williams, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, doing excellent. And
Good.
congratulations on being named as one of the 8 fierce feminists to watch out for 2017.
Thank you.
So from your perspective, what is feminism?
To me, feminism is a tool and an ideology for social justice and equality. That's simply it. I know that people have a lot of ideas about what feminism is and who they think feminists are, but feminists are pretty much just any people who believe that women are also people, and the definition of woman is not rigid and it's not binary, and people who are just simply about the equality of all genders.
Yeah, and from your perspective, what does that look like when you say equality of all genders? Because you hear a lot of different things what that actually means. So what does that mean to you?
To me, equality of all genders just really means just that. There is equality, but just in order for one group to have equality, that doesn't mean that rights or power has to be taken away from another group. It just simply means, to me, putting people on an equal footing as human beings and regarding their rights and their humanity on the same level, and making sure that they get the same access to resources that other people do, regardless of their gender, and not just their gender. Because I think one of the reasons why feminism is important, and particularly Black feminists, feminists of color, their research and their ideologies has been important, because it forces us to not just think of white women as the default category for women, because that's pretty much what happens, particularly in this country. But what feminists of color force us to do is not only think of women just as this one monolithic category with white women as a default category, they also force us to think about women who are poor, women who have disabilities, women who have different sexual identities, women just across the board, just all these intersectional identities that we have, and how they intersect and create a distinct social experience for us is what feminists across the, well, not all feminists, well, is what feminism calls for, but particularly women of color feminism and Black feminists.
So that's interesting. Let's talk about that a little bit more, because what stands out to me is from the Women's March on Washington. I can't remember the exact name of it.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. I remember seeing a photo of a group of white women who were saying, we support, Hillary Clinton, or we don't support Donald Trump in the White House. And then there was a photo of a Black woman saying, but they voted for him, or something like that. Right?
Yeah, it was like 94% nah, or something like that. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. So because so about 94% of Black women voted for Hillary. Is that correct?
Right.
And only maybe like 55% or even less than that. I can't remember the exact number of white women, but it was just substantially lower. How do you think that happened? Why do you think that happened?
Well, I'm no political scientist, but just as someone who has read a lot about race, racism, and also gendered issues, I believe is that really what this election came down to is about not only race, but also about people preserving what they feel to be were their proper and legitimate and rightful access to resources in this country. And for some folks, that their whiteness ended up superseding their gender. So they ended up voting for who they voted for.
Right. And, that's what I think too. That was definitely my thought process is, in that particular case, race trumped gender. So as a
Yeah.
Black woman who is quote unquote, I don't know, I don't even call it double negative, but, who has two strikes against them in society, or, you hear all these different types of phrases. I don't know what the correct one is. How do you relate like Black women feminism versus like the overall feminism movement? Like, what specific things are Black women facing that might be different? That might be just yeah, I guess that just might be different than what women overall are facing.
Okay. And well, before I even answer that, I mean, and I totally understand where you're coming from, but I don't necessarily see my Blackness or my womanhood as strikes. But I do totally understand what you're saying,
Right.
that there are two identities that I possess, and I possess others too that are stigmatized in this country. But I think that's one place for us to start when we think about our identities and ideology, is not come from a deficit model, but come from an asset model. So I see like my Blackness, my experience as a Black person, my experience as a woman, and then when you intersect those two, I feel like my experience as a Black woman is an asset to any environment in which I step into, because I have the lived experience of being a Black person, of being a woman, and being a Black woman, and also being a Midwesterner from my region, being a poor person, being someone who, when I was assigned to cover social services as a reporter about 15 years ago, I didn't have to learn about what it was like to sign up for food stamps or to go through different processes, because I lived through that through my childhood. So I feel like when we bring our identities with us, we bring a lot of experiences that are legitimate sources of knowledge. So that's why I say I don't really see a lot of the identities, even though we know that they are oppressed identities in society, but with those identities, we also bring a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience with us. But with that being said, when you talk about feminism across the board and different experiences that Black women have, I think it is important to recognize that feminism across the board has not always been welcoming to Black women. And that's why we saw, and I wrote about this too, that there were a lot of Black feminists who did not go to the Women's March, because they felt that with just what you mentioned earlier, the numbers in which white women voted and Black women voted didn't show solidarity as women across the board during the presidential election in 2016. So there were a lot of Black feminists who were saying, we supported white women in November 2016. So why should we just a couple months later in January stand in solidarity with them now when they didn't stand with us in solidarity on election day? So for that reason and others, because there have been instances in which white feminists have not stood in solidarity with Black women, like Susan B. Anthony, for example, is heralded as a feminist hero, but she is also someone who, and this is well documented, that she said she would cut off her right arm that makes sure that the Negro had the right to vote. And when she was talking about the Negro, she was not just talking about Black men, she was talking about Black women too. So there are several instances in history when white women really have not at all been inclusive when it comes to feminist issues and ideologies. But at the same time, and I think Tamika Mallory, who was one of the organizers of the Women's March, did a really good job of saying that even though some Black women understandably didn't want to be involved with the Women's March because they felt that this was another example of historic exclusion, but at the same time, Tamika Mallory said that if Black women are not at the table, then we're on the menu. So it's important for us to be in all these spaces all of the time and making sure that we are a part of the decision-making process so that our voices will be heard and so that others won't be speaking on our behalf. So I actually went to the Women's March. We took some students there for the march and also for the inauguration, because here at Wake Forest University, I work with the L.com media scholars with Melissa Harris Perry through the Anna Julia Cooper Center here. And one of the things that we wanted them to write about was not only just what were their experiences at the Women's March as young millennial women, but also their experiences at the inauguration. So I just mentioned that to say that I was actually there, and there were some interesting things that happened that I witnessed and also that our students talked about. But to me, Black feminism is about really looking at those intersections of race and gender and how they really are important and how they really do create distinct social experiences for women. But there are even Black feminists and feminists of color across the board who have challenged not only white feminists and Black feminists, but all feminists to be inclusive of lesbians, to be inclusive of women with disabilities, to be inclusive of people with who their gender varies across the gender spectrum. So feminism to me is not just about the equality of white, middle class, educated women. It's really about fighting and advocating for the equality of everyone, essentially. And particularly, I think one thing that men don't think about is how feminism is actually really advocating for them too, because one of the things that feminists are really serious about is disrupting this gender binary where we say that there are only two genders, male and female only, and that men are privileged over women and women are subordinate to men. But I think that the gender binary not only should be disrupted because there should be room for gender variance, but also what happens with these traditional gender roles is that they also lock men into some really unreasonable expectations that really can become toxic for them. Because I don't think that, and this is just my opinion, and this is just how I live, I don't think that every man should always be the breadwinner. I don't think that men always have to fix everything, and the responsibility of caring for everyone in a household and just doing everything should not fall on the men. I think that everybody should do their equal work and their equal share, and just these ways in which we have these traditionally masculine expectations for men puts a lot of pressure on them too, and can be extremely toxic and can really cause them to act out their masculinity in really toxic ways. So feminism really works to disrupt that. So feminism is not only something that is beneficial for women and people across the gender spectrum, but also particularly for men. Even though we're not working to privilege men at all, but what I'm saying is that this is really about equality across the board and equality in terms of our expectations from one another.
Yeah, that's actually going to be my next question: is why should men care about feminism, right?
Why? To me, to ask why should men care about feminism is to ask why should men care about women. And I think men should care about women because women help them come to be in their lives. Like women gave birth to them, and women are an integral part of their lives every day. And I mean, and if you don't care about more than half of the population, because women are the majority of the population, if you don't care about women, then you really don't care about society. And if you don't, then you really need to check yourself before you wreck yourself, because it's not good for your health.
Right. I love the 1990s reference right there.
To paraphrase Ice Cube a little bit.
Yeah. No, because that's interesting. And I think you're right about a lot of times men get locked into these gender roles as well. And women have often historically gotten the short end of the stick, historically over the last, thousands and thousands of years. And, being able to change that to foster a healthy society going into, I guess, the 22nd century here in the next 100 years or so. And it's always been interesting to me because a lot of men don't really see the connection, right? They don't see how.
But that's not by mistake either, though, right? Like men not seeing these connections, even women not seeing these connections, that's not by mistake, because I mean, the patriarchy helps to maintain this status quo and this imbalance of power that a lot of people benefit from. So why would schools be teaching about that? Because a lot of ways in which schools work are really gendered and white. And so a lot of these, like when we talk about heteropatriarchy, which privileges men and sets up this gender binary, and white supremacy, all of these ideologies and systems of power work together to create oppression and to maintain the status quo of power. So no one's teaching about white supremacy. No one's really teaching about heteropatriarchy. So of course, men don't really see where this has like any relation to them because they're not taught about it. And there is a reason why, so that all of us will just really go on and really continue to live our lives in these certain ways that help to maintain the status quo and the imbalance of power. So yeah, people don't see where it relates to them, and they're not supposed to.
Right. So on that note, then, how do you think that, people can break the hetero patriarchy? Like, what types of things you think they can do to, break that in society?
Well, I think first people can really educate themselves and really kind of take a step back and look at how power and oppression are both set up, and who they are established to benefit and who they're established to oppress. I think that's really important. So if we take a look at the ways in which white supremacy works across the board, then we will see naturally that this is a system that doesn't work for people of color. And then, so like I was talking about earlier, like with intersectionality and intersections, if we take a look at how power is set up and who is not supposed to benefit from it, then I feel like we can start to deconstruct some of these myths and some of these stereotypes and social constructions about different groups, right? I think that's one thing that we can do. And then I think people can really act on it in the ways in which they not only interact on an individual basis with people, but also at the voting box or even at their jobs, right? So like, say, for example, if you are a faculty member at a university and there's some policies that are coming up about childcare or breastfeeding or whatever it is, or hiring more women or hiring more people of color, then maybe you should vote for those policies to make your university more inclusive. If you're a citizen in a city and there's a city ordinance on the ballot, that really makes LGBT people a protected class, then maybe you need to vote for that. I think there are a lot of different ways. If there are companies that have proven themselves to be anti-woman, anti-Black, anti-LGBT, then maybe you should stop investing in those, showing an investment in those companies by spending your money with them. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do on an individual basis, just in our regular daily interactions and how we live their lives. But I think as voters and people who have an impact on policy, we can educate ourselves and act on what we know.
Right. I love that explanation. I really do. And on a, I guess, tangential subject, your actual experience comes from the intersection of race, gender, and also media.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you think media plays a factor in all of this that we've talked about so far?
I think media, we know that a lot of what we learn, period, and a lot of what we learn about different groups is what we learn through the media, because I have been teaching, I guess, 7 years now, I don't know, kind of, sort of. But in all the time that I have been teaching at universities now, students also, particularly white students, pretty much always say that being in this class, whatever the class was, is the first time, or being in college was the first time I had interactions with Black people, or the first time I had interactions with Latinas or Asian people, because they come from these suburbs from across the country where their neighborhoods are pretty much monolithic. They all have gone to pretty affluent public schools where all of their classmates have been white. And I've had a lot of students tell me that not only am I the first Black professor that they ever had, but the first Black teacher, period.
Wow.
So some of these white kids are going from K through 12 without having any Black teachers at all. And not just the white kids, some of the Black kids are having that experience too. So, but what students have said though is like, I grew up watching the Fresh Prince of the Bel-Air reruns. So I kind of knew Will Smith from 20 years ago, but like I never really had like anyone in my life, like a real figure that I identified with. So a lot of what people learn about one another is what they learn through media. And we already know that the media's job is not to really create these complex and complicated narratives that really tell the truth and the history about a people. The media's job is to make money, because we do live in a capitalistic society too, right? And especially when we talk about advertisements and commercials, like that's pretty much the goal is to, and there's this really famous quote from Michael Eisner, who used to be the CEO of Disney for more than 20 years. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, our job is not to really tell stories. It's not to change the world. Our job is simply to make money. So I think that's really important for people to understand, that that's what the media's job is supposed to do. But one of the ways that is easy for show producers, show runners to make money is by, and to get the audience's attention, is by using stereotypes. And we know that stereotypes are very dangerous. They are wrought with social constructions that were designed to keep people in place and to marginalize them and to oppress them. And we know that stereotypes are also distortions and myths of the humanity of certain groups, right? So when we think about the media, and if this is the only place that we're being introduced to people who have marginalized identities, like Muslims, like Black people, like Latinos, like people with disabilities, like poor people, these are all marginalized groups within society. And if the media is our only introduction to them, and if the media is pretty much recycling stereotypes about them, then we're not learning the truth about these people. And we're not learning about their humanity and their real experience. So what we're really learning is these narratives that are created by people who live in places of privilege and people from the dominant society who are basically just recycling stereotypes that date back to colonialism, genocide, slavery, and other forms of oppression. So the media pretty much upholds and recycles these stereotypes and does like a faulty job of teaching us who our neighbors are.
Interesting. So you hear a lot of, Black people talk about owning your own media outlets and changing the representation of, Black people and women and poor people and just all the different types of marginalized communities through different outlets. Are you seeing that happen now? Are you seeing media becoming more fractured, where everyone's having their own little groups that are promoting different images, or are you finding that these like fractionalized groups are promoting the same images?
Well, I don't know if I want to say fractured, but for one thing, I think it's really important for us to always have ethnic media, because when we think about different entities like Jet Magazine and Ebony Magazine, those are publications that were, and still are, Black owned, and that were really reporting and even go looking at more regional and local Black owned newspapers like the Chicago Defender. These are publications that were covering the civil rights movement when mainstream media didn't care and when they didn't. So that famous and really unfortunate photo of Emmett Till's beaten and bloated body, that was published by Black media, right? Mm-hmm. So that just goes to show that, we have always covered ourselves in ways that other people wouldn't. And even going back to the work that Frederick Douglass did with the press, there's always been a voice and a way that Black people have covered like the truth and the authenticity and the humanity of our experience that others simply have not, for several reasons that I've mentioned already, because to do so would be to disrupt the status quo, and would also be for some of these media companies to show ways in which they are complicit in helping to recycle and keep and reinforce some of this oppression. So when we talk about fracture, I guess I'm really kind of cautious about using the term fractured media, because I think when we're talking about media outside the mainstream, it is important for us to have that media outside of the mainstream exist, because they are not always constrained by some of the forces that mainstream media is. And again, when we talk about Black people's lived experience, like there are questions that I don't have to ask when I was a full-time reporter. There were questions that I wouldn't have to ask going into a specific neighborhood, because I've grown up in neighborhoods like this. Like I know people like this. So there's like an inherent lived experience and knowledge that I bring with me to some of these stories that other people necessarily can't. And that's, again, the same thing for ethnic media. And ethnic media, whether it be Black media, Latino, Asian media, whatever it is. So I just, again, want to be cautious about saying fractured, because media that exists outside the mainstream, I think, is important, because they will offer critique and analysis that we will never get from the mainstream. But when it comes to maybe digital media, I think something that is important is that social media has given people a voice and has allowed them to be able to, and enabled them to be able to amplify their voices at lightning speed in ways that we haven't seen in the past. Now, that's not to say that social media is just this wonderful place where everyone's really nice to each other, because
parts of social media too. Right?
Absolutely. There's a lot of misogyny and racism and misogynoir, pretty much like this really special form of racism and sexism that's reserved for Black women that exists. But again, we have been able to see see activists really use this as an organizing tool, and not only as an organizing tool to organize for social justice for people in certain areas of the country and for Black people not only across the country, but across the globe, but we're able to learn about things that are happening happening to people like us more quickly than we were before. So this year is the 25th anniversary of the LA riots.
Oh, wow.
And I was a freshman in college then. So, I mean, that's something that we were keeping up on the news. We were keeping up with that story on the news a lot, and we engaged. I went to Philander Smith College for my first year in undergrad at historically Black college in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we were participating in our own protest there in our freshman year outside of the Little Rock Police Department. But one of the things that I thought when I look back now, one of the things that I think is so interesting is that the way that we kept up with what was going on was through the news. And that was through the news between like 7 and 9 a.m., most likely like the Today Show, CBS Morning News, or whatever it was before we went to class. At noon, during the noon newscast, and at 6 or 6:30, 6 for local news, 6:30 for like NBC nightly news or whatever, and then at 11. But now we live in this like 24-hour news cycle where we can get our news all the time. And, you know, like I have a smartphone here, I'm talking to you on a laptop. So these are two other devices, mediums where I can not only watch the news, but also have access to news online. We didn't have that back then. Right. We just simply didn't. Like, we just had to get our news whenever the networks wanted to give it to us. So I think what is really different about today, especially in terms of social media and the ways in which Black people are using it, is that it has democratized knowledge now. We don't have to wait for other people to give us information. The people who are on the ground can give it to us immediately. And I think that's something that's really important. So, I mean, I think maybe in this, what we call Matrix era, oh, I'm sorry. In this Matrix era of media where there is so much there, that it might be difficult sometimes for people to find media that they trust and that they really see as a reliable source. But at least we don't have just the 3 main TV stations anymore. We do have multiple arenas where we can get our news, and we have people out there like Elon James and others who have like their independent media resources where we can actually find out news that we are concerned about. I mean, even a show like Roland Martin's morning news show on TV1, I mean, that's something that, you know, I never would have imagined, to be honest, in my lifetime, like 25 years ago, for there to be like a national news show that focused on issues that are of particular concern to Black people. So again, we might see some of that as fractured, but again, it's important because we always need those sources outside of mainstream media to tell us what's really going on. Because like on Elon James's resource, on his on his social media channels, and Roland Martin's, and even places like Kimberly Foster's For Harriet, I've seen news stories there that I haven't seen anywhere else. So I think that in this digital matrix age, it's really important for us to have sources outside of the mainstream that are going to give us a perspective and really just give us stories that we're not going to see anywhere else.
And I love it. I can listen to Has anyone ever said they can listen to you talk for hours upon hours at a time?
No.
Really? No.
No. People have told me I talk too much.
No, I think I can. I think I can do that. Just listen to you, because I learned so much speaking with you. And I think we're out of time.
Thank you.
But
okay.
Just one last question is, you know, what's next for Dr. Williams? What do you have up for 2017 and for the next few months?
Oh, Dr. Williams is working on some research and trying to finish it up and get it out. One thing that we're working on right now is this project in which we're interviewing young Black millennials between the ages of 18 to 24 to talk to them about how constantly watching these police brutality videos online are having an impact on them. Because when we think about this media studies theory called cultivation, which talks about how once we continue to watch certain things over time, it has an impact on us and creates a certain type of reality for us. So we know that Black people across the board, and especially younger Black people, use social media and mobile devices more than other folks, right? So if this young group is constantly seeing images of people like them getting killed all the time, what kind of impact is that having on them, and especially in their formative years? So there's a team of us here at Wake Forest who we're looking at that. We've been interviewing people for, I want to say, almost 2 months now, and we're still interviewing folks about that. So we're doing this this qualitative study using in-depth questions to talk to young people about that. And so that's the main thing that I'm working on right now. And also there's just some other research that I've already done that I'm getting in shape to be published. So what's up for me is just continuing to look at ways in which mainstream media continues to uphold forces of oppression and continues to recycle myths and untruths about us that have consequences not only for us, but also for other people and how they see us and interact with us.
Okay, perfect. Well, I can't wait to read your new research about millennials and police brutality and their effects on the minds of people. So definitely looking forward to that.
Thank you.
For those of you out there, Dr. Williams is one of my absolute favorite speakers that we have of Great Black Speakers. Highly, highly requested. She speaks about anything related to race, gender, and the effects of media on both of those aspects of a person's personality and characteristics. So if you'd like to book Dr. Williams or any of our other speakers, head over to www.greatblackspeakers.com. It's easy to search for her in the search box. Easy to search for any of our other speakers in the search box, and we're looking forward to continuing to help shape and create these conversations in color. So Dr. Williams, thank you so much for your time today, and you have an
Thank you for having me. You too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.